The rain had started just before dusk, a slow drizzle that turned the sidewalk slick and silver. Dr. Elias Monroe pulled the collar of his coat up against the cold, his stethoscope still looped around his neck like an afterthought. He had just come off a double shift at St. Clair, the city's aging but proud hospital tucked into the older part of town, where the bricks still held stories from decades past. His mind was fuzzy with fatigue, but his body moved on instinct, weaving through puddles and people, aching for the warmth of his small apartment and maybe a leftover sandwich. It was a soft thud that made him stop. A sound that barely rose above the din of the street, a man collapsing like the air had been stolen from him. Elias turned quickly, eyes scanning, and then saw him. A figure crumpled on the edge of the sidewalk near a row of shuttered storefronts. Late middle age, tall even in his fall, wearing a suit that once was expensive but now hung damp and wrinkled. No one else seemed to notice. People hurried past with umbrellas, faces tucked down, eyes set forward. Elias didn't hesitate, he ran. The man was unconscious, his skin pale, his breathing shallow and erratic. A hand trembled briefly at his side before going still. Elias crouched, gently tilted the man's chin up and checked his pulse. Faint, irregular. "Sir, can you hear me?" he said quietly, his voice steady despite the thud of adrenaline in his chest. He glanced around for help, but the street remained indifferent. Elias loosened the man's tie, pulled his coat around him for warmth, and began a quick assessment, checking pupils, airway, responsiveness. Years of medical training took over. His hands moved calmly, rhythmically. Within minutes, he called an ambulance, relaying information with brisk efficiency. Then he stayed, held pressure to a vein that was visibly collapsed, whispered reassurances to a man who didn't respond, and stayed. The ambulance lights finally cut through the rain-slicked dusk. When the EMTs arrived, Elias stepped back, his hands cold and shaking now that he'd stopped moving. One of them recognized him. "Dr. Monroe, you working this case?" "I found him on the street," Elias said. "Possible cardiac or insulin-related collapse. He's not carrying ID. Gave him basic support until you got here." The EMT nodded. "We'll take him to St. Clair. You coming?" Elias hesitated. He was exhausted, but something in the man's face, a quiet kind of loneliness, even unconscious, made him nod. "I'll follow." By the time they got the man stabilized in St. Clair's ER, Elias was past running on fumes, but he stayed, he monitored, he helped intubate when the man's breathing worsened. He updated the nurses and checked vitals every half hour. The man didn't wake, not fully. There were flickers of consciousness, a twitch of fingers, a furrowed brow, but no clarity. No family showed up, no phone calls came in. When one of the nurses pulled Elias aside and said, "We can't find anything on him. No ID, no wallet, nothing. He doesn't even have a phone," Elias just nodded. "I'll sit with him," he said. "Are you sure? You've been here almost 18 hours." Elias looked through the small window into the ICU room at the man's face, lined but not old, peaceful now that machines were breathing for him. There was something familiar about him, but Elias couldn't place it. "I'll stay a little longer," he said. And he did. He stayed until dawn began to stain the sky. The man woke 3 days later. Elias was reviewing charts nearby when the nurse paged him. When he entered the room, the man's eyes were open, startled, confused, flicking from the ceiling to the walls to Elias. "You're in a hospital," Elias said softly. "You collapsed on the street. I was nearby and got you help. You're stable now." The man didn't speak right away. His mouth opened slightly like he had to remember how. "My name, do they know my name?" "No," Elias said carefully. "You didn't have anything on you. Can you tell me who you are?" The man blinked slowly. Wesley Hale." Elias noted the name. The man's voice was raw, quiet, but clear. He offered water, a brief explanation of what had happened, the tests that had been run. Wesley listened with a patience that seemed practiced, like he was used to silence, used to waiting. "I remember the rain," he said eventually, "and walking. I'd been walking a long time." Elias nodded. "You were lucky someone found you." Wesley turned his head slightly, meeting Elias' eyes. "You found me." "Yes," Elias said and smiled. Wesley Hale became a quiet fixture in the ICU for the next week. Recovery was slow but steady. The hospital's social worker couldn't find any relatives, no contacts, but Elias began stopping by more often than necessary. He learned small things. Wesley liked his coffee black and hot. He didn't mind silence, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. He asked Elias once, "Why'd you stop?" Elias shrugged. "Because you needed help." "People need help all the time," Wesley said, "but not everyone gets it." "Maybe I was just tired enough to pay attention." Wesley gave a soft, low chuckle. I've found that exhaustion reveals a person's truest nature. Elias stayed a little longer than he should have that evening. There was no fanfare, no moment where Elias learned the truth. Not then. Wesley Hale left the hospital quietly, but not before he handed Elias a folded piece of paper. For when the timing is right, he said. Elias opened it only after the man was gone. Inside was a name scribbled in thick, angular letters, Mara Hale, and a phone number. No explanation. Just a name. Something about it made Elias shiver, though he didn't know why. He tucked the paper into his wallet and carried on with his life. It would be weeks before the truth came to light. Weeks before the name Wesley Hale would be spoken on every news broadcast across the country. Before his face, once pale and silent in a hospital bed, would become a household image. Before Elias would realize he hadn't just saved a man's life. He'd saved a legacy worth $800 million. But none of that mattered yet. For now, there was only the rain, the memory of warm hands, and a name waiting to be understood. The paper stayed in Elias' wallet like a folded secret. He didn't call the number, not right away. Life at St. Clair's rolled forward in its unrelenting rhythm, patience in, patience out, long nights and early mornings, a blur of fluorescent light and quiet heroism. And yet, Elias found himself thinking about Wesley more often than he meant to, not because of the mystery, but because of the silences they'd shared. The way Wesley had looked at him, curious, steady, like he already knew something Elias hadn't learned about himself yet. It was late November when Elias heard the name again. He was halfway through a turkey sandwich in the break room when one of the nurses, Becca, burst in with her phone raised. "You're not gonna believe this," she said, dropping into the chair beside him. "Remember that guy you brought in a few weeks back, the one who collapsed?" Elias looked up. Wesley. Wesley Hale, she emphasized, waving her phone. He was missing for almost 4 months, billionaire tech guy. They found him like a year ago and then he vanished. Everyone thought he went off-grid or died. Turns out he was in our ICU the whole time and nobody knew. He reached for her phone slowly, his heartbeat suddenly heavier. The article was from a national news outlet. Wesley Hale, tech mogul turned recluse, reappears after mysterious disappearance. There was a photo of him, clean-shaven, suited, staring into the camera with an expression that felt distant and tired, different than the man Elias had met, but still him. "He's worth $800 million, Becca said, her voice pitched somewhere between awe and disbelief. "And you saved his life on the street." Elias set the phone down carefully. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the point," she said, staring at him. "You didn't care who he was, you just helped him." He stood and threw away the rest of his sandwich. The food felt like sawdust now. "Can we not make a thing out of this, please?" She raised her hands in mock surrender. All right, but damn Monroe, that's something." Elias nodded once, but his mind was already elsewhere. The folded paper in his wallet, the name. Mara Hale. That night after the city had exhaled into its nighttime hush, Elias stood in his kitchen with the number dialed into his phone, thumb hovering over the green call button. He hadn't tried to trace her, hadn't even searched the name online. It felt like Wesley had handed him something personal, something not meant for the world to interpret. He pressed the button. It rang 3 times. Then a woman's voice answered, warm but cautious. "Hello." "Hi," Elias said. This might sound strange. My name is Elias Monroe. I'm a doctor at St. Clair's Hospital in New York. A man named Wesley Hale gave me your number." There was a pause, then a breath. "You're the one who saved him." Yeah," he said. "I was nearby when he collapsed. He never explained who he really was, not until I saw the news." The woman was quiet again, but her silence was gentler this time. "I'm his sister," she said softly. "He told me about you." "He did?" "Yes, not everything, but enough. He said you reminded him what decency looked like." Elias didn't know what to say to that. He leaned against the counter, the phone warm against his ear. "He left so much behind," she continued. "The company, his name, even me. He just disappeared one day and wouldn't say why. But then a few weeks ago he called, and he was lighter somehow, still guarded, still Wesley, but something had shifted. I think meeting you changed him." Elias exhaled slowly. "I didn't do anything special, just what I'm supposed to do." "You stayed with him," Mara said. "That's not nothing." They spoke a little longer about small things, the weather, how Wesley was doing. Mara invited Elias to meet her in person sometime. "He wouldn't ask, but I think he wants to see you again." Elias promised he'd think about it. When he hung up, he stood in the stillness of his apartment for a long time, phone clutched in hand, wondering why his chest felt both heavy and open at once. 2 weeks later, he took the train to Cold Spring, a small town tucked into the woods north of the city. The trees were bare, skeletal branches reaching skyward, the Hudson River still gray beside the tracks. Mara met him at the station. She was younger than he expected, sharp-eyed, quiet in a way that wasn't shy, just observant. They walked to a small cafe, talked over coffee. She asked about his work, his life, and Elias found himself answering honestly. No embellishments, just truth. It was disarming. "I know why he disappeared," she said suddenly, near the end of their conversation. "He lost someone, his wife, years ago. He built everything after that, the company, the empire, but he never really came back from it." Elias looked down at his mug. "Grief does that. He said you didn't ask for anything, that you didn't try to get close for a reason. I didn't know who he was. But even after you didn't reach out, you waited." Elias met her gaze. "I wasn't sure I had the right to." Mara nodded. "Well, now you do." Wesley lived in a quiet estate on the edge of the river, not ostentatious, just intentional, the kind of home built to hold silence and not feel empty. Elias hesitated at the front steps, his breath fogging in the late afternoon air. The door opened before he knocked. Wesley stood there, looking older than he had in the hospital bed, but stronger too, more himself. "I wondered if you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure I would," Elias admitted. Wesley nodded once and stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the house was warm. There was music playing low, something classical, cello and piano, and the scent of cedarwood lingered faintly in the air. They sat in a room with tall windows that looked out over the river. Neither of them spoke at first. It wasn't uncomfortable, just full of things unspoken. "You gave me back more than my life," Wesley said eventually. "You reminded me what it feels like to be seen without judgment. That kind of clarity, it doesn't come often." Elias shifted slightly in his chair. "I didn't mean to do anything extraordinary." "That's what made it extraordinary," Wesley said. They talked for hours after that, not just about the past but the quiet, uncertain future. Wesley didn't offer money. Elias didn't ask for answers. They just shared a space that felt honest, rare. By the time Elias left, the sky had turned the color of frost. Wesley walked him to the door and paused, his hand resting on the frame. "Would you come back?" he asked. Elias smiled. "I think I already am." As he stepped into the cold, Elias felt something shift inside him. Not because Wesley Hale was worth $800 million, but because, for the first time in a long while, it felt like something was just beginning. The visits became a quiet rhythm. Elias returned to the river house the following weekend, and again the weekend after that. There was no schedule, no invitation needed. It just happened like the turn of the season or the stillness between two heartbeats. The train ride north became something Elias looked forward to, a reprieve, a place untouched by the sterile urgency of hospital hallways and fluorescent lights. Wesley greeted him at the door each time. There was no fanfare, no forced conversation. Sometimes they sat by the fire and spoke for hours. Other times they barely spoke at all. They read in silence, sipped coffee, or walked the tree-lined paths near the edge of the property. One afternoon, as the wind rattled the windows and a thin layer of snow began to dust the ground, Wesley spoke of his wife for the first time. "Her name was Caroline," he said, eyes not on Elias but on the fire. "She made everything feel softer, even when the world didn't deserve softness." Elias listened, letting the silence stretch as far as Wesley needed it to. The grief in his voice was quiet, not raw, not anymore, just settled, lived in, like an old ache he'd stopped trying to fight. "We tried to have children," Wesley said. "She wanted a house full of them, laughter in every room, but it never happened, and when she got sick, I think part of me died with her, the part that believed joy was still possible." Elias didn't answer with platitudes. He simply shifted closer and placed a hand over Wesley's. Wesley didn't flinch. His fingers curled around Elias slowly, like he wasn't used to being held but had always remembered how. Winter deepened. At the hospital, Elias moved through the motions with the same steady competence he always had, but something had changed. Colleagues noticed the difference. He smiled more, lingered in the maternity ward after deliveries, paused to listen instead of rushing from room to room. There was a stillness in him now that hadn't been there before. "You're seeing someone," Becca said one night after a late shift. She said it like a fact, not a question. Elias chuckled. "Not in the way you think." "Then what is it?" He thought of the way Wesley watched the river when he thought no one was looking. the quiet joy of brewing coffee side by side, the conversations that unfolded not with urgency but with trust. It's complicated, Elias said, but the warmth in his voice betrayed the hope he hadn't yet named aloud. In February, Wesley fell ill again, not serious, just a persistent cough and low fever, but it rattled Elias more than he expected. He rushed up on a Tuesday night, walking straight into the house without knocking. He found Wesley curled in a thick blanket near the fire, pale but calm. "I told Mara it was nothing," Wesley said, voice hoarse, "but she sent you anyway." "I came on my own," Elias said. "You scared me." Something flickered across Wesley's face, surprise, then something gentler, gratitude laced with affection. "I'm fine," he said. "I know, but I'm still staying the night." Wesley didn't argue. Elias made tea in the dark kitchen, his hands remembering the cupboards like they belonged to him. He sat with Wesley into the small hours, checking his temperature, listening to his breathing, feeling something settle in the silence between them. That night, Wesley reached for his hand again. It was the first time neither of them let go. By early spring, the house had changed. There were new books on the shelves, some of Elias' favorites, a second toothbrush in the upstairs bathroom, mismatched mugs Elias had brought from a local market, small things, but each one a sign of something taking root. Wesley had changed too, not in appearance but in presence. He laughed more, cooked dinner instead of ordering out. Sometimes he'd leave Elias handwritten notes tucked into coat pockets or books. "This one reminded me of you," or "You make the silence feel kind." One weekend, as they stood on the back porch watching the river swell with meltwater, Wesley turned to Elias and said, "I think I've been waiting for you longer than I realized." Elias didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His hand found Wesley's. They stood like that until the sun dipped low behind the trees. Then came the offer. It arrived not from Wesley, but from a lawyer in a sharp suit who showed up at the hospital asking for Dr. Monroe by name. He handed Elias a folder. "It's a foundation," the man said. "The Hale Foundation. Mr. Hale is naming you as executive director if you're willing." Elias flipped through the documents slowly. It was all real, money set aside for medical relief, community health initiatives, scholarships for underrepresented students entering the field. A vision Elias had once dreamt about in medical school, but buried beneath the demands of day-to-day survival. "I didn't ask for this," Elias said. "No," the man replied, "but you inspired it." Elias closed the folder. "Tell Wesley I'll talk to him about it, not you." The lawyer gave a small smile. "He said you'd say that." That evening, Elias stood in the kitchen of the River House, folder still in hand, as Wesley sautéed garlic and spinach for pasta. The scent was warm, comforting. "You're really doing this," Elias said. Wesley didn't look up, "Only if you say yes." "Why me?" "Because I trust you," Wesley said, finally meeting his eyes. "And because you didn't want anything from me when I had nothing. That's the kind of person I want building something better." Elias set the folder on the counter. His chest ached in the quietest, most beautiful way. "I don't know what this is," he said, voice soft, "what we're becoming, but I want to find out." Wesley stepped closer, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "So do I," he said. They didn't kiss, not yet. But when Wesley reached for his hand again, Elias didn't just hold it. He pulled him closer. The foundation launched in late spring. It began quietly without press releases or galas. No photographers, no spotlights, just a gathering of minds inside an old church building Wesley had purchased on the west side of the city. He insisted they leave the stained glass windows intact. "People need to feel something when they walk in," he said. Elias stood near the back on opening day, watching volunteers arrange chairs and sort through donated medical supplies. There were stacks of laptops in one corner, already preloaded with telehealth software for underserved clinics. In another, a wall had been painted with a mural, bright hands extended in every direction, palms open. Mara arrived with fresh coffee and a quiet smile. She was a steady presence now, often bridging the space between Wesley's past and his fragile, blooming present. She hugged Elias without hesitation. "He seems lighter," she said, glancing toward the front of the room where Wesley was deep in conversation with a pediatric nurse from Harlem. Elias followed her gaze. He's starting to believe in forward motion again. "Because of you. Because he chose to let someone in again." Mara nodded, same thing. They didn't move in together, not officially. Wesley's home by the river remained his sanctuary, and Elias kept his apartment near the hospital for nights when shifts ran too long. but they fell into a rhythm that blurred the lines between separation and belonging. Weekend mornings in the same kitchen. Books passed back and forth with notes scribbled in the margins. A drawer slowly filling with Elia's socks. Wesley stopped referring to the river house as my home. One night in early summer, while they were watching the rain beat across the tall windows, he said without looking away, "I like it better with you in it." Elias didn't answer right away. He lined into the words, let them settle. "I think I belong here," he said at last. Wesley turned to him, something in his eyes softer than anything money could touch. "You always did." At the hospital, Elias continued working. He refused to become the kind of man who left medicine behind for administration. He cut his shifts back slightly, 3 a week now, enough to stay grounded, enough to keep his hands busy and his heart tethered. One night, after helping an elderly man through a frightening but minor stroke, Elias stepped outside the emergency bay into the warm dusk. The city lights shimmered like stars had fallen too close to the ground. His phone buzzed, Wesley's name. "Still up," the message read. Elias smiled. "Always," he replied. He took the long way home, walking until the noise of the hospital had faded from his chest. In July, they traveled together for the first time, just a long weekend in coastal Maine. Wesley had once promised Caroline they visit there together, but she died before they could. He'd never been back. Elias didn't ask questions. He simply booked the trip and said, "You don't have to carry the promise alone." They stayed in a weathered bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean, walked the quiet beaches barefoot, ate oysters on a rickety dock with sunburned fishermen and salt in their hair. Elias watched Wesley move through the space, not as the man who once ruled tech summits or graced business magazine covers, but as someone rediscovering the miracle of ordinary moments. One night the tide came in unusually high, and they stood on the deck watching the water reach the edge of the lawn. Wesley leaned into Elias, his voice almost lost to the wind. "I was scared I'd never feel this again." Elias wrapped an arm around him, grounding them both. "You didn't have to know how," he said, "you just had to stay open to it." Wesley turned to him, eyes shining with something unspoken, and for the first time since their lives had tangled together, he kissed Elias. It was slow, sure, no urgency, no hesitation. Just the quiet truth of two people who had stopped waiting for perfect and begun reaching for what was real. When they returned, things began to change in ways neither of them had expected. The Hale Foundation drew attention not for its wealth but for its focus. The clinics it helped build were staffed with nurses from the communities they served. The scholarships funded students who'd never dreamed they could afford medical school. The mental health program, championed by Elias, trained former patients as peer counselors. People noticed, not the ones in high places, but the ones who mattered. A woman who'd once lost her son to an untreated infection now ran the front desk of a free urgent care clinic in Queens. A teenager Elias had once stitched up for a stab wound showed up at the foundation asking how to volunteer. And still, through it all, Wesley remained just Wesley. He turned down interviews, declined every invitation to speak at summits. When a journalist emailed Elias asking for a comment about Dr. Monroe's relationship with the reclusive billionaire, Wesley simply chuckled and said, "Tell them the truth, he's the one who saved me." By early autumn, Elias began staying at the river house more often than not. His lease on the apartment lapsed quietly. He didn't need a drawer anymore. He had space. He had a key. He had someone waiting for him when the days ran long and the world grew too loud. One evening, as golden light poured through the trees and the river glimmered like a sheet of quiet fire, Wesley came to him with something small in his palm. "Okay. I don't want you to have a drawer," he said. "I want you to have the house." Elias blinked, a laugh caught somewhere between disbelief and tenderness. "Are you asking me to move in?" "I'm asking you to make this a home, ours." Elias took the key and slid it into his pocket. "Okay," he said, voice low and steady, "let's make it ours." That night, as they fell asleep in a room filled with windows and the soft rustling of leaves, Elias thought about the man he'd once found lying unconscious in the rain. He thought about how fragile a heartbeat can be, how close a person can come to disappearing completely. And how sometimes, all it takes to change a life is a stranger who kneels beside you and refuses to walk away. The first snow came early that year. Elias stood at the wide kitchen window, a mug of coffee warming his hands as the world beyond turned soft and white. The trees had surrendered their leaves weeks ago, their branches now holding tufts of snow like delicate offerings. The river moved slow and dark beneath the weight of winter's hush. Wesley stepped in behind him, resting a hand on Elia's back. His touch was quieter now, not from weakness, but from a kind of reverence, like each moment between them mattered in a way that couldn't be rushed. "You always watch the first snowfall like it's the first time," Wesley said. "It always feels like it is." Wesley smiled. "That's the difference between you and the rest of us. You let wonder stay." Elias turned to face him, letting his hands slide around Wesley's waist, coffee abandoned on the sill. "It stayed because I found someone to share it with." Wesley leaned in and kissed him, slow and familiar, like a vow whispered across seasons. Later that day, they drove into the city. It was the last board meeting of the year for the foundation. The team had grown diverse, sharp, full of fire and compassion. Mara had taken on a leadership role, balancing Wesley's strategic vision with practical wisdom. Elias had grown into his position with quiet authority, not from title or inheritance, but from presence, from showing up, again and again. When he walked into the meeting room, people stood a little taller, not out of reverence, but out of trust. They discussed expansion plans, including a mobile unit for rural outreach and a partnership with a city college to offer debt-free nursing programs. Elias watched from the end of the table, Wesley beside him, their hands brushing beneath the wood. It wasn't about money anymore. It never really had been. It was about healing, about restoring the kind of dignity people forgot they deserved. About reminding others that they were seen, that they mattered, even when they arrived empty-handed and broken by the world. After the meeting, Elias lingered behind. One of the newer volunteers, a boy barely 20, with a nervous energy and paint still caught beneath his fingernails, approached him. "Dr. Monroe," he said, "I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't think people like you were real." Elias smiled gently. "I'm not doing anything you couldn't do." The boy looked down. "I'm not anyone important." Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to be important to change someone's life, you just have to stay." As the year edged toward its close, Elias and Wesley began a new tradition. Each week they wrote a letter to someone whose name they didn't yet know, patients, students, strangers who'd crossed their paths. They didn't always send them. Sometimes the letters lived in a wooden box near the fireplace, bound together with string, but writing them reminded them where they'd come from. Reminded them that once a man had collapsed on a rain-slicked street, and another had stopped not because of duty, but because he couldn't walk away. One evening, as snow dusted the roof and wind brushed the window panes, Elias opened the box. He pulled out the very first letter, one Wesley had written weeks after leaving the hospital. It read, "To the doctor who didn't see my net worth, only my pulse. Thank you for choosing kindness when you could have kept walking. Thank you for seeing a man before you saw a mystery. I didn't know then that you would become my home, but I think a part of me hoped. That hope saved my life more than your hands ever could. W." Elias folded the letter gently and placed it back inside. Wesley sat nearby, legs tucked beneath him on the sofa, a book open in his lap. "Do you ever think about that night?" Elias asked quietly. Wesley looked up. "All the time." "Do you think we'd still be here if I hadn't stopped?" Wesley's smile was small, tender. "You were always going to stop, that's who you are." Elias walked over, sat beside him, and leaned into the warmth of a life slowly built with care. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. Wesley closed his book and reached for his hand. "I'm glad you saw something worth saving." They spent New Year's Eve at the River House, just the two of them. No grand parties, no countdowns, just firelight, blankets, and music low on the stereo. At midnight, they clinked glasses, apple cider, both of them trying to be healthier now, and Wesley made a quiet toast. "To the one who reminded me that hearts, no matter how bruised, can begin again." Elias raised his glass, his voice barely above a whisper. "To the one who taught me that love doesn't need to be loud to be real." They drank and kissed, and held each other as fireworks cracked in the distance like the world trying to remember what light felt like. In the years that followed, the foundation grew. More clinics, more stories, more lives quietly changed by people who chose to stay. But none of it ever felt larger than the first moment. The simple act of one man seeing another not as a stranger, not as a statistic, but as someone worth kneeling beside in the rain. Wesley never returned to the public eye. He didn't need to. He had a home now, a partner, a life shaped not by wealth or legacy but by choice. And Elias. He remained a doctor, a steady hand in a chaotic world. But more than that, he became someone who believed again, not just in medicine, but in the way love could find you when you weren't looking, when you'd stopped believing it was meant for you. Not with fanfare, not with fireworks, but with a hand held through the dark, a name whispered into silence, and a life quietly forever changed.